Thank you very much for talking to us.
It's wonderful to be here.
I think it's fair to say that your visit, even more than usual, has created quite a stir, not least because of your remarks yesterday. I'm going to try and sum up the response like this. People are saying, OK, we have a special relationship, and yet that special relationship could involve going to the back of a queue. How does that work?
Well, actually, the special relationship, as I said yesterday, is not contingent on any particular issue. There are emotional and cultural and commercial and strategic bonds between our two countries that are unmatched by any two countries around the world. As a practical matter, what we're doing with respect to trade is negotiating with big blocks of countries because negotiating trade deals are a heavy lift. They're challenging, they're difficult. So we recently completed a deal involving 11 nations, the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the Asia-Pacific region. That's now pending ratification by Congress. Our next step is to try to negotiate a EU-United States agreement, the TTIP as it's known. And the point I was simply making was that for those who suggested that, you know, if we could just not be entangled with the Europeans, our special relationship is going to mean that we can just cut the line and just get a quick deal with the United States and it'll be a lot more efficient. That's not how we think about it. I don't think that's how the next administration will think about it, because our preference would be to work with this large block of countries. Now, the more essential argument that I was making is that it is our belief that a strong United Kingdom helps the United States because we are so close. And as I indicated yesterday, it is my firm belief, I think backed up by the evidence, that a United Kingdom that is in the European Union will have more influence, be able to leverage its viewpoint more effectively, and ultimately that will redound to the benefit of jobs and businesses here in the UK.
It's the phrase, isn't it, the back of the queue, which has, I suppose, offended some people and alarmed others or scared them. Yeah. Was that the intention?
No. As I said, it was simply a response to, I think, the argument that I've heard from others who are proposing to leave the EU, that somehow America would be able to do things more quickly with the UK than if they were in the European Union. And I was simply indicating that that wouldn't be the case in this narrow issue of trade.
Just on that narrow issue.
Yeah.
So if people read into that, okay, let's say Britain leaves, it's a big if, let's say there's then an attempt to negotiate an independent trade deal, that all other applicants for a trade deal with the US would then take precedence over the UK. I mean, that's what's been read into it.
You
Are
know,
they wrong to do that?
They are wrong to do that. My simple point is that it's hard to negotiate trade deals. It takes a long time. And the point is that the UK would not be able to negotiate something with the United States faster than the EU. We wouldn't abandon our efforts to negotiate a trade deal with our largest trading partner, the European market, but rather it could be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, before we were able to actually get something done.
So maybe not right at the back of the queue, maybe towards the back of the queue. Is that right?
I think the broader point is that if you're interested in trade, we are on the cusp of getting a trade deal done with the European Union. If I am a business person or a worker in Britain, and I'm looking at the fact that I already have access seamlessly with a massive market, one of the wealthiest markets in the world, that accounts for 44% of my exports. The idea that I'm going to be in a better position to export and trade by being outside of that market and not being in the room setting the rules and standards by which trade takes place, I think is erroneous.
You've been very clear. The special relationship, you just said it, is much more than trade. Trade's important, it's much more than that.
Exactly.
We've been focusing on lots of things, including intelligence sharing, given the very real threat from terrorist groups around the world. Is it possible to say today that if there were an exit from the EU, those elements of the special relationship wouldn't be affected? What is your sense of that?
They wouldn't be affected in the sense that our intelligence teams work extremely close, our militaries work extremely closely together. Where it would have an impact is that we also have to make sure that continental Europe is safe in order to keep us safe. And the fact that the UK is involved in conversations about how we upgrade information sharing in continental Europe, the influence that it has in debates in Europe around how do we approach intelligence, how do we approach law enforcement, how do we break down some of the silos that prevent us from preventing the kinds of horrific crimes that we've seen in Brussels and Paris. I think we will together be less effective if we're not in those forums than we are currently, where we've got this great ally who engages in unmatched cooperation with us in the room negotiating. You know, things as simple as making sure that passenger lists are shared. It took a lot of years for us to be able to negotiate that with the European Parliament and the EU. And our strongest advocate for getting that done was the UK. And it was extremely helpful. That, in turn, makes us both safer. Because it's not as if by exiting the EU, you're going to stop tourists from traveling from Europe to the UK any more than we're going to stop Europeans from visiting the United States.
For all of those people watching, trying to calibrate the arguments that you've offered, because you've offered arguments on several levels, and if they're wondering, okay, if there's a British exit from the EU, how will that have the biggest impact on the special relationship? What will be the most noticeable or measurable impact on the special relationship of an exit? How would you describe that?
It is the impact that it has on the UK that's relevant, not the impact that it has on the special relationship.
But on the bond?
Well, the bond between our two countries is unbreakable. The issue is that precisely because we share so much, we see the world through such a common prism. We want to make sure that our partner, one of our most important partners in the world, if not the most important partner, maximizes its leverage, maximizes its power. And that's the core of my argument. Our cooperation is not going to be changed. Our ability to do things together will not be changed. What we do believe is that the United Kingdom will have less influence in Europe, and as a consequence, less influence globally. And since we rely heavily on the UK as a partner globally on a whole range of issues, we'd like you having more influence. We'd like you being at the table helping to influence other countries who may not oftentimes see things as clearly from our perspective as our British partners do.
There will be some people watching. They put a much higher price on the bond with the US than they do with the bond with the EU.
Sure, of course.
And they will say, the president's very clear. The special relationship is not going to be damaged by any decision on coming in or out of the EU. And if that's the case, we shouldn't be concerned about coming out. That's how they'll probably relay the argument. What would you say to them?
Well, I guess what I would say, and Prime Minister Cameron mentioned this yesterday, if the countries that are closest to you, that care about you the most, the countries with whom you cooperate most frequently, those who you have a special relationship with, are suggesting to you that you might be better off staying in this relationship with Europe, it's worth paying attention. Now, ultimately, there's going to be a decision for the British people to make, and we entirely respect that. But in the same way as in our personal lives, if we're making a big decision, we should probably pay attention to the people who we've counted on, who we've stood by with, who we have a history with, we should probably pay attention when they say, I think this is the right thing to do. My hope is that this is something that would have some influence on how voters think. I don't anticipate that anything I've said will change the position of those who are leading the campaigns in one direction or the other, but for ordinary voters, I thought it would be relevant to hear what the President of the United States, who loves the British people and cares deeply about this relationship, has to say about it.
Can we talk about the remaining 9 months of your presidency?
Yes.
Because you clearly still have big ambitions. You made that clear in your meeting earlier today.
Yeah.
There's a sharp focus once again on some of the really dangerous flashpoints around the world. Libya is one.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say there were a few eyebrows raised, certainly here earlier this year, when you expressed some frustration with how some European leaders, including Mr. Cameron, had responded to the challenge in Libya. You said that he'd been distracted. Why did you think that?
Well, I think that we were all distracted. That portion of my comments, I'm sure, got attention here. What maybe got less attention was my statement that one of my regrets is not fully anticipating the degree of concentration and focus that would be required after the campaign to make sure that Gaddafi wasn't killing his own people in Libya. So this was something that I think we all share some collective responsibility for. I continue to believe it was the right thing to do, that had we stood by passively, that Gaddafi would have killed enormous numbers of his own people. Libya would have been embroiled in a continuing war that would have been even more disruptive and damaging. But what is also true is that we now have to focus on that country stabilizing itself and having a government that can actually function and we can interact with. The good news is this Government of National Accord, very tentative, very fragile, is beginning to come together. And prior to coming here, I was in Saudi Arabia, where many of the countries I was meeting with have had influence with militias or various factions within Libya. And my message to them was, give this government a chance. Isolate the extremists, allow moderates from all the various groups to come together. It is in all of our interests that Libya has a functioning state. And we should be less concerned at this point with perfection in Libya and more concerned with just standing something up where people can provide basic services. We can begin training their police and their border security. It has enormous ramifications over the long term for Europe. It speaks to one part of the migration crisis that's been taking place, but also it's a critical component of our overall campaign to defeat ISIL.
If your range of options in Syria includes a military option of some kind, are you concerned in the European context, for example, that parliaments like the British Parliament have shown very little appetite to be engaging in that way? So how would that affect your thinking in terms of the options that you have?
Syria has been a heartbreaking situation of enormous complexity. And I don't think there are any simple solutions to Syria, and those who pretend that there are probably haven't been paying a lot of attention to the details. It is my view that it would be a mistake for the United States or Great Britain or a combination of Western states to send in ground troops and overthrow the Assad regime. But I do believe that we can apply international pressure to all the parties, including Russia and Iran, who essentially are propping up Assad, as well as those moderate opposition that exist and may be fighting inside of Syria, to sit down at the table and try to broker a transition. Now that's difficult, and in the interim, we continue to strike ISIL targets in places like Raqqa and to try to isolate those portions of the country and lock down those portions of the country that are sending foreign fighters into Europe. So there's going to be a military component to this to ensure that even as we try to bring an end to the civil war, we're also engaging in the counterterrorism activities that are necessary. But in order for us to solve the long-term problems in Syria, a military solution alone, and certainly us deploying ground troops, is not going to bring that about.
There are plenty of voices in Europe, you will know better than anyone, who say that part of the reason that Europe has been dealing with such a big migration crisis is the lack of assertive response, if you like, or the lack of assertive engagement, not least from the US. What do you say to those people?
Well, you can't have it both ways. You can't say we don't want to do anything in Syria. Our parliaments won't ratify any actions in Syria. But we do want the United States to do something about it. One of the challenges during the course of my presidency, I think, is to encourage everybody to recognize that whether we like it or not, we are in an interconnected world. This relates to Brexit, this relates to NATO, this relates to the migration crisis, this relates to our counterterrorism efforts, it relates to public health issues like Ebola. It is a problem in the United States as people have debates about immigration from places like Mexico. It would be, I think, tempting for a lot of people to believe that we can pull up the drawbridge, that we can carve a moat around ourselves and not have to deal with problems around the world. But we don't have that luxury. And if these problems are transnational in nature, then they require a transnational response. And it requires us to build international institutions and support regional and international structures that are not perfect, can often be frustrating, by definition require us then to take into account, well, here's what the French think on this, and here's what the Germans think on that, and here's what the Japanese think about this, and they may not always align perfectly with our views about what we think needs to be done. On the other hand, in the absence of such cooperation and alliances, we are far weaker and we won't solve these problems. And that's true in Syria, but it's also true with a whole host of other issues that we're going to be dealing with for decades to come.
Lots of us have followed with great interest and enjoyment a major documentary series here on British television inside Obama's White House, following all kinds of controversies along the way and challenges to legislative challenges. And you say very clearly at one point, you convey the frustration with being unable to deliver some things, principally because of Congress's attitude. Right. So I'm just wondering, for the last 9 months that you have, what realistically would you say to our viewers that you think you can achieve? Possibly not in a legislative sense, but what are your principal goals?
Well, there are a couple of things that have international ramifications. The Paris Agreement around climate change is a huge achievement if we implement it effectively. And so I'm going to be making sure over the next 9 months that I am working with other leaders internationally to put that into full force and effect. Prosecuting the campaign against ISIL is critical. And although I don't anticipate that in the next 9 months it will be finished, because unfortunately even a small pocket of extremists, if they're prepared to die themselves, can still wreak havoc on many of our cities. But I do think that we can slowly shrink the environment in which they operate and take on strongholds like Mosul and Raqqa, that is the beating heart of their movement. There's some wonderful work that we're doing internationally on public health, building off of what happened with Ebola, now Zika in Latin America, trying to create public health structures in countries around the world, recognizing that that's not just charity, it's in our self-interest, because disease migrate very rapidly in this globalized world, and I think we have a chance in the next 9 months to have a global health security infrastructure that I care deeply about. In places like Africa, we have something called Power Africa, where we are trying to leverage private sector resources, private capital, to help electrify a subcontinent that has been growing very rapidly, but it still lags far behind in terms of electrical power. So there are a range of things internationally, concluding an agreement on a trade deal with the EU. It may not get ratified through Congress before I leave, but if we have that deal done, then the next president can pick that up rapidly and get that done. So I'm a busy guy. This whole myth of lame duck so far has not proved, hasn't proved to be the case. And I'm confident that here's one thing I can guarantee. I won't get everything done that I want to get done, but I'll get a whole bunch done that makes these next 9 months worthwhile.
A final question, if I may, Mr. President.
Please.
We enjoyed the images yesterday. You're at Windsor, driven around by the Duke of Edinburgh, which is a courageous thing to do. I'm clearly enjoying it, and First Lady at your side. And one of the questions that a colleague of mine wanted to put to you, and I'm going to put it to you because it's a good question. Just give us a sense of what the First Lady has contributed to your presidency and how it's gone.
Well, look, I think I cannot separate anything that I've achieved from the partnership that I've had with that remarkable woman. First and foremost, she's the best mother I know, and my daughters are amazing because of her parenting. I am labor, she's management, you know, so I can take very little credit beyond executing some of the plans that she has, but she's also proven to be an extraordinary public figure in her own right, in a very difficult job, because the First Lady doesn't have clear, defined roles, and what she's been able to do in changing first the conversation in the United States and then globally to some degree around children's health issues and childhood obesity and exercise and eating, what she's been able to do in the United States for our wounded warriors and our veterans, and now what she's doing with an emphasis on girls' education and making sure that our policies are aligned with the basic wisdom that countries that do not educate their girls and treat women well will fall behind. You know, in each of these tasks that she's taken on, she's done so with style and flair and enormous focus, and she's made a real difference without a big budget. You know, she's not somebody who you know, has access to millions of staffers and billions of dollars, and yet she's changed how people think about these things. So I could not be prouder of her, and you know, I think it's fair to say that anything good that I've done, she gets shared billing.
Mr. President, great honour to talk to you.
It's been
and
wonderful.
Enjoy the rest of the visit.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Many thanks.
Good.